Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Foley and Lardner for today's program titled Diving Deeper into the Revised Stark and Kickback Rules. If you have any questions about any of today's topics, we invite you to type them into the Q&A widget on the left side of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the program. If you experience any technical difficulties with the webinar platform, please refresh your browser or see the webcast help guide on the bottom of your screen, which is designated with a question mark icon. For attendees seeking CLE credits, CLE codes will be announced throughout the presentation. Please enter the CLE code in the polling slide that will appear on your screen. Attendees seeking Kansas, New York, and New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete the attorney affirmation form in addition to answering the polling questions. A copy of this form is available in the resource list widget on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please email your completed form to mweschler@foley.com immediately following the program. CLE certificates of attendees will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after this webinar via email. As a final note, there is a short survey located on the right side of your screen, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. And now I will turn it over to Larry Vernalia and Don Romano to begin today's program.
Thank you all, and good morning. We appreciate you joining us. Don, Eric, Rachel, Adam, and I are going to take you through, over the next couple of hours this morning, a really significant set of rules being published in the December 2nd Federal Register relating to both the physician self-referral or Stark law and the federal anti-kickback statute. These rules have been styled by the American Hospital Association as game changers. In Health Affairs, shortly after they were published, the former administrator Seema Verma and Kim Brandt wrote an article about them describing that these regulations were designed to take these sets of rules into the 21st century. I think there's a considerable amount in here which is very positive for the provider and healthcare community more broadly. Much of the conversation that's happened so far in the month or so since the rules were published has focused on a couple of the big ticket new exceptions and safe harbors to Stark and anti-kickback, in particular, those relating to value-based arrangements and some new exceptions and safe harbors for EHR and cyber security. And we will talk about them today, although those are the ones that you will have heard of. But there are hundreds of other pages of documents that were published together, and they include a number of really important business and legal issues that we think the community needs to spend a little more time thinking about. So we're going to cover many of those other topics herein. There are more than 700 of you registered today, and we thank you for your attention. What that means is we will try to answer some of your questions in the Q&A feature of the website here throughout, but we will also take some time at the end. If we don't get to any of your questions, we're sorry about that, and we'll try to reach out to you after the program. The slides are extensive, and obviously we won't be able to cover all of them, but they're available as a download for you as a reference for both during and after today's program. So with that, let me just turn the mic over to my colleague Don Romano before we get started in the weeds. Don?
Well, thanks, Larry. I don't have much to add to that. I would caution people that there is a lot of valuable material and crucial guidance that's in the preambles to the rules. So I know that they're very, very long, and one may be tempted to just read the text changes in 42 CFR. But if you do that, you will be missing some crucial guidance in the preambles. So unfortunately, for those of us who practice in this area, or for those clients who habitually are engaged in transactions and other arrangements with physicians that require familiarity with the Stark rules, you really do need to pay attention to the preambles. The last comment that I'll make is that although these rules were intended to modernize and in some cases simplify rules, there is still plenty of complexity in the rules, and there is in some places an added degree of complexity brought about by the new rules. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Larry and Rachel to begin our program.
Thanks, Don. And so what Rachel and I would like to do, as I said, many other programs have talked about the value-based arrangements, exceptions, and safe harbors. We're going to try to offer you a bit of a gestalt for how to organize your thinking around them. It's fair to say that it's probably the most complicated set of Stark and anti-kickback exceptions we've seen in some time. And there are parallel track sets of rules for both the Stark as well as anti-kickback statute safe harbors. And there are some commonalities to them that we want you to think about as you read through them and think about how to use them. But maybe a way to take a look at it from a step back is understanding what Stark does and what anti-kickback does. So as you know, Stark is a civil rule that prohibits referrals for Medicare services between physicians and certain entities that furnish designated health services unless an exception is met when they have a financial relationship. It's in the context of a physician arrangement with a DHS entity like a hospital or a lab, it's sort of the floor. If you don't meet one of those exceptions, you can't pass go and you can't make referrals. So for all of these exceptions and safe harbors we're going to talk about here, if you've got physician referrals and physician financial relationships, you really must meet the Stark rules. If you don't, however, you don't have to think about that. And you can focus exclusively on the OIG safe harbors. There are some pretty important differences between the two. And if that orientation is helpful to you with thinking of Stark as the floor, the way CMS wrote its regulations when thinking about the Stark exceptions was to kind of have that bare minimum to satisfy the requirements that CMS thought were necessary to allow more value-based payment and contracting arrangements between physicians, hospitals, and others. And the OIG's rules were a step higher in complexity and in terms of the challenge to meeting them. Some of the distinctions that are important, and I'm going to be interested in Rachel's views in a moment as well. Some of the distinctions are when thinking about risk contracting and how much risk needs to be taken on and when risk is even necessary. Only in one of these series of arrangements do the value-based enterprise have to take on risk for purposes of Stark, and that is in the full risk VBE exception, unlike for the anti-kickback statute. All of the regulations, both the AKS and Stark, are going to prohibit payments for reduction in medically necessary services. Both of them only protect payment arrangements associated with compensation, not ownership. Interestingly, only the anti-kickback safe harbor has a restriction on volume or value of referrals being considered. And the Stark exceptions have no fair market value requirements, whereas one of them is found in one of the anti-kickback safe harbors. There are some differences in terms of what level of monitoring and oversight is required, but I think a fair understanding of this as you conceptualize it is once you've set up a arrangement to satisfy the Stark exceptions, really with the exception of the no risk arrangement at all, the third category, you can sort of plug and play and the rules will operate pretty carefully. The anti-kickback statutes safe harbors that are in the new OIG requirements have a lot more micromanagement, we think, and we're going to spend a little time talking about that. One of the most important things to understand is how these rules are organized. They're set up with a series of really important definitions. And then those definitions, though they cross-reference each other, become the cornerstones for whether you can satisfy the requirements. Rachel, would you walk us through some of these important definitions?
Absolutely. Thanks, Larry. And these definitions, as Larry said, become a little frustrating for all of you probably when you're reading them because they do internally refer to the same words over and over again. But I promise you will get through them. I just want to highlight a couple of the more important ones. I also want to highlight that in line with what Larry says about the OIG kind of more so micromanaging things, these definitions become much more relevant with respect to the OIG safe harbors as opposed to the Stark exceptions, although they're still relevant. So most importantly, what is a value-based activity? A value-based activity, and what we're talking about now is actually what the types of actions that these safe harbors and exceptions are going to protect. So a value-based activity is activities reasonably designed to achieve at least one value-based purpose, including provision of an item or service, the taking of an action or refraining from taking an action, e.g. the coordinating of care plans across providers for target patient populations. The second one that's really important is what a value-based purpose is. So value-based purpose is actually a limited, it's not a including, but it's a, these are the only 4 value-based purposes within these definitions. And I should have also mentioned that one place where the OIG and CMS did align is with respect to these definitions. And for the most part, the definitions fully align within them. However, I will point out that the OIG decided to make the action of making a referral excluded from being a value-based activity. But back to the value-based purposes, that's limited to coordinating care of the target population, improving quality of care for the target population. And this is important, both reducing costs, but not while reducing quality. So you have to do both in order for it to be considered a value-based purpose. Keep quality at the same level while also reducing costs. Doing just one is not sufficient. And then the last one is transition of health delivery and payment mechanisms. So moving more from a fee-for-service type of arrangement and healthcare world to a more value-based. So, you know, to kind of move on from those definitions and kind of how they become important, and also to point out some commonalities and differences between the three different options under each that were promulgated in this final rule. What we see is that both of them have what's called a full risk type of exception or safe harbor. Under the full risk, the definition is pretty similar. That means that the value-based enterprise is taking on the risk of the total cost of the patient care. And that is uniform between them. And both, it gives a year of runway. This kind of, and a lot of these exceptions and safe harbors do remind me of some of the MSSP waivers, but this gives a year of runway. You just need to be at full risk within a year of entering into the value-based arrangement. Both the OIG, for the OIG, it only allows for exchanges between the actual value-based enterprise, which is kind of the loosely affiliated group that is entering into this value-based arrangement, to the value-based participants, whereas CMS allows for exchanges of value between the participants as well as between the enterprise and the participants. Also, the full risk for OIG requires both a QA program, which CMS does not require, and a writing. Again, CMS does not require writing unless there's a condition of referrals back to a particular provider, in which case a writing is required. Something that you'll notice with all of these is as the risk goes up, regulation goes down, and then you'll see a corresponding increase in regulation as the risk goes down. So we see that the elements to each of these safe harbors and exceptions are much lower as the risk is high. Next one is the kind of middle risk, or that's what we call it. They're named something a little bit different. In terms of some of the main commonalities and differences there, the OIG requires that both the value-based enterprise and this kind of middle tier, as well as the participants, take on risk in order to be eligible for the safe harbor. The VBE must take on risk with respect to a payer, and the participant either needs to take on risk with respect to the payer or the VBE, whereas for CMS, their middle risk exception only requires that the participant take on risk with respect to amounts that the VBE has paid to the participant, so much less risky. Similar to the full risk for the middle risk category, the OIG allows for 6 months of runway prior to the VBE taking on such risk. Similar, and this is true for all of them, again, the VBE can only, under the OIG, only exchanges of value between the VBE and the participants is protected, whereas kind of all exchanges are protected with respect to CMS. Another thing, and this goes back to the kind of micromanaging, is the compensation for the OIG under all of these really requires like a direct connection between the remuneration and the value-based activities, the remuneration must be used for those activities, whereas CMS only requires that the remuneration relate to the activities. So by way of example, if the remuneration related to activities that a participant provided, that would be acceptable, whereas for the OIG, it really needs to be used for those activities. As to this kind of no risk category, which there's one of these both under the CMS exception as well as the OIG safe harbor, they have a lot of commonality. They have the highest level of regulation, the most elements that need to be satisfied. Something I'll point out, though, is that under the OIG, one of the more significant things is that it can only be in kind, no cash remuneration for this, for coordination of care under the OIG. Also, the participant must pay at least 15% of the cost of any in-kind remuneration that's provided, whereas there's no such requirement by CMS. So again, CMS is definitely setting the floor, whereas the OIG is trying to achieve a higher standard of compliance. But I will turn it over to Larry to dig in a little more to the 3 stark exceptions under the new value-based rules.
Well, what I want to do is also to make sure that we're keeping this at a high level to understand what some of the meaningful distinctions are between these 2 sets of rules. Another one is really what entities can take advantage of these safe harbors and exceptions. For purposes of the stark exceptions, it's not limited to the types of DHS or designated health services entity that might be interested in participating. So hospitals, labs, DMEPOs can all participate in these exceptions, and that's not true for the OIG safe harbors. They're more limited. Rachel is right, I think, in thinking about the fact that there are a variety of compliance safeguards that increase as the level of risk goes down, and we've organized the 3 by that. And my final comment on the stark exceptions before we get moving along is to recognize who has to be taking risk in any of these exceptions. For purposes of the stark rule, the value-based enterprise in the full financial risk model is the entity that takes risk. The physicians and others aren't necessarily taking risk, even though they may be participating in the value-based enterprise. And we've had some questions about what is a value-based enterprise. For stark purposes, it's extremely a loose definition. It doesn't even need to be a corporation. It's not like an ACO. It's just a group that decides to come together to form a value-based enterprise. So in the first level of exception, the VBE exception, at full financial risk, it's the VBE that takes risk. As distinguished from the second tier, the meaningful downside financial risk, where it is the participant, the physician, who is at risk of losing 10% of their payment or foregoing 10% of a payment. That's their risk, where the value-based enterprise doesn't need to be assuming any risk. And finally, that third category of exception for risk value-based activities, which we're calling sort of a general bucket list, neither party needs to take on any risk. Rachel, do you want to offer some similar comments on the AKS safe harbors before we turn it on to Eric?
Absolutely. And something that I will add to that, Larry, is one of the things that is interesting and distinct about the Stark law's exceptions and the fact that neither the meaningful downside risk nor the kind of no risk category require any risk is that this can be used for CMS purposes for arrangements completely unrelated to MA or any risk. Also, these Stark exceptions apply to all patients, not just patients that are Medicare beneficiaries, to protect arrangements between DHS entities and physicians. So with respect to the risk levels under the anti-kickback statute, I talked about this a few minutes ago kind of at a high level, but kind of more specifically, full financial risk, very similarly to with Stark under AKS, Safe Harbor, only requires that the value-based entity take on that risk, and no risk is required for the participant. On the other hand, under the substantial downside financial risk, there's a second piece to it, which is meaningful financial risk for the participant. So under this element, or under this particular safe harbor, both the VBE and the participant must take on risk. For the VBE, there's one of 3 different risk kind of categories they can fit within. Kind of the one that is easiest to understand is taking on 30% upside or downside risk. Others have to do with per member per month reimbursement, and another one with respect to a specific set of care services. With respect to what it means for the participant to take on that risk, is they must be within one of two risk categories. One is that they share in 5% or more of the upside or downside risk of the BBE, or they are receiving some sort of per member per month payment for the care services that they've agreed to provide under the value-based arrangement. Whereas, again, similar to Stark and CMS, this care coordination arrangement, number 3, is really no risk at all for either party. But I'll point out, as I did at the beginning, that this is really the only one under OIG that can be utilized to protect an arrangement where there's no MA or risk plan involved. So these safe harbors are much more limited in what they will apply to than the CMS exceptions.
But again, Rachel, you're not required to meet a anti-kickback safe harbor, whereas you are required to meet a Stark exception if Stark applies. And so that's why that Stark floor is going to be critical. I think that some folks have asked, as they first read the proposed rules, why do we even need these value-based exceptions when we have some existing exceptions under Stark and AKS for risk-sharing arrangements and eligible managed care organizations? There's some interesting commentary in the preamble that some in the industry were reading the risk-based exception more broadly, perhaps, than the current folks at CMS thought we should, and therefore this new set of rules was designed to fill in some of those gaps. It's also important, I think, that these rules and exceptions are useful for things other than payer contracting strategies. I think that as the dust settles on this body of rules, we're going to see lots of opportunities to use them creatively in beneficial arrangements between physicians, hospitals, and others that maybe that we weren't able to do before. So with that, let me stop here and move on to our next topic, which is not that, which is Eric. Where are you, Eric? There you are.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So the second cool thing that people talk about in this set of rules is relating to some new exceptions in the safe harbors for cybersecurity. Eric?
Are we going to jump to cybersecurity? Here we are. Okay, so this is continuing on the theme of commonality between Stark and the anti-kickback statute. We're going to talk about EHR and cybersecurity. So let's jump to EHR first. Okay, so this is a modification to an existing rule with regard to exceptions and the safe harbor, which generally allows a DHS entity to subsidize EHR items and services. Broadly speaking, the changes are made to continue the exception, to clarify it, and to provide a little bit more flexibility. So first, the exception and safe harbor are now permanent. They have removed that sunset date. The government has recognized that the industry has made substantial progress in implementing EHR, but there still has plenty to go. The second is changes to the deemed interoperable provision. So, like the other deeming provisions, it is an option. It's not required, and the intention is just to provide some certainty. And donations that do not satisfy the deeming provision will still satisfy the definition of interoperable for safe harbor and the exception. In the change for interoperable, they made a clarification here that the certification must be current as of the date of the donation, as opposed to having been certified at some point in the past. So if, for instance, the EHR software item loses its certification, it won't satisfy the deeming provision, but it still may be, fall in the definition of interoperable. CMS and the OIG decided to keep the 15% cost sharing requirement. So if you want to be able to provide an EHR software item or service without any cost sharing contribution, then you're going to have to do it under a value-based arrangement. The contribution, with regard to the timing, the contribution has to be made upfront by the physician for the initial and replacement EHR. But for updates, the physician can pay it at reasonable intervals. So the rationale was that for this was that, you know, updates sometimes are urgent, and we don't want to increase the burden or create unnecessary delays. The fourth bullet point here relates to cybersecurity, and they clarified that cybersecurity software and services have always been allowed under this exception. But the key words here are software and services, and they have to be associated with electronic health records, cybersecurity for electronic health records. And hardware is not included in this exception, whereas it is included in the cybersecurity exception. And finally, they remove the requirement that the donor does not have to have actual knowledge of the fact that the physician possesses or has obtained items or services equivalent to those provided by the donor. The government recognized that there are legitimate reasons to switch EHR software programs, and that also has the added benefit of avoiding lock-in. They also revised the exception in Safe Harbor to remove the current prohibition on limiting or restricting the use, compatibility, or interoperability of items or services. So does that mean that the donor can now restrict the system or block information? No. The rationale here is that the Cures Act, and there's some other laws that added prohibitions on information blocking and also created some exceptions for it, so that was just better suited elsewhere. And also the recipient is unlikely to have capabilities to determine if the donor has engaged in information blocking. Okay, so that covers the EHR exception in Safe Harbor. So moving on to the cybersecurity. This has gotten a lot of attention, and I think for good reason. The new exception in Safe Harbor for cybersecurity is based on the recognition that there is an urgent need based on a growing threat of cyber attacks. And these both endanger patient safety as well as result in identity fraud. So I think this shows the intention to encourage investment in this space. It's a really flexible exception, and it's pretty broad. So, you know, to the extent that you're a provider or a hospital system or something, and you want to know how you can better support physicians, I think this is one that's going to end up being very popular. And for those that are counting, there are now at least 3 exceptions that overlap in providing cybersecurity. So it's the value-based exceptions, the EHR exception I just talked about, and now this standalone cybersecurity exception. So the requirements here, this protects non-monetary remuneration consisting of technology and services that are necessary and used predominantly to implement, maintain, or reestablish cybersecurity. So this is limited to non-monetary compensations, and in Kickback statute speak, it's called in-kind remuneration. And technology is defined as any software, licenses, information technology, including hardware. So examples of this include installing and updating cybersecurity software, cybersecurity training. That can include, training recipients on how to use cybersecurity, how to prevent, detect, and respond to threats, help desk services that are specific to cybersecurity, and even the provision of a full-time cybersecurity officer in a physician's office. So it's much broader than the EHR exception, that it allows staffing. It includes business continuity and data recovery services. And it also could include third-party monitoring, risk assessments, responding to threats and attacks. With regard to hardware, it could include things like encrypted servers, encrypted drives, two-factor authentication doggles. So what doesn't it include? So if a software has multiple functions, it's only eligible for protection here if cybersecurity is their predominant function. So, word processing, claims and billing applications, data analytics, they're not included. And also what's not included is physical infrastructure. So locks on doors, upgraded wiring, physical security. So with regard to prohibitions on what the donor cannot do, donor cannot take into account the value referrals. So unlike the EHR exception, the cybersecurity exception does not list a criteria that are deemed appropriate. The concern here was they didn't want to have a prescriptive requirement, so they wanted to leave it very broad. So I think it's safe to say that under the EHR deeming requirements, those are probably all going to be okay, but you have additional flexibility here. Further, the donor cannot condition the donation on future referrals, and with regard to the safe harbor, department only cannot shift the cost onto any federal healthcare program. Finally, for this slide, the recipient, with regard to the recipient can't make the donation or the amount or nature of the technology a condition of doing business. The OIG was concerned about physician groups using cybersecurity as a bargaining chip or to create a bidding war scenario. With regard to the writing requirement, so here it's interesting, there's a reasonable person standard. So CMS says the appropriate standard is that contemporaneous documents would permit a reasonable person to verify compliance with the exception at the time the referral is made. The safe harbor actually has a signed writing requirement. Oops. And there is no cost sharing is required. So if you want to know why, first of all, it's seen as a self-protective measure. So when you have an interconnected system between, a hospital system and say physicians, there the DHS entity, the hospital, is really trying to protect itself because it's only as strong as the weakest link. And the cybersecurity is seen as less risky than the EHR exception, since the EHR exception or an EHR system facilitates an exchange and potentially locks in referrals. And for similar reasons, there's no limitation on the donors, the types of donors, unlike EHR. And in the safe harbor, there's no limitation on recipients. So even a patient could be the recipient of this. Okay, so that completes part two. These changes that are in common between Stark and any Kickback statute. I'm going to turn it over to Larry and Don to discuss part three.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So we're going to talk about some key definitions, and along with the value-based exceptions, this next part has probably got the most ink. There are certain requirements which we tend to think of as substantive requirements that are in the exceptions rather than so-called technical requirements, and that is fair market value, commercial reasonableness, and thou shalt not take into account the voluntary value referrals. So the first one, fair market value, I think the takeaway here is that it's pretty much business as usual. There's really not any real change, in my view, in fair market value. The definition is rearranged somewhat. Note here that there's certain things in the statute, certain language in the statute that CMS felt the need to parrot in the regulatory definition. And so that, I think, has guided a lot of the structure of the definition. One thing to keep in mind is that CMS did not accept the suggestion to clarify the language consistent with fair market value in the exceptions. The PSA exception says that the compensation cannot exceed fair market value. In the other exceptions, it uses the language consistent with fair market value. And CMS construes that to mean that it can't be less than and cannot be more than fair market value. If it had taken the position be more than fair market value when the physician is getting paid something, and it has to be at least fair market value when the physician is the one that's paying. Then we would have consistency with the way the OIG looks at matters, and really wouldn't have any risk of fraud and abuse. But that's not how CMS sees it. It sees that it's bound by the statutory language that way. So I'm going to go by these slides pretty quickly. Again, I think it's just really reorganizing the definition, and there is some technical aspects to this that are probably better left to the fair market valuers. One important point here that CMS made, if you look at the bottom bullet point, is that what is fair market value may not always align with salary surveys, which we are all familiar with looking at. Fair market value could be more or less than in a survey, and a lot of people have been saying that for quite some time, so it is nice to see CMS recognize that. So I'm going to move on to the volume or value of referrals. And here CMS adopts what seems to be a pretty simple test, which is that if there's a positive correlation between two variables, and so if referrals result in more referrals result in more compensation to the physician, that's going to take into account the volume of value referrals. It's basically the same thing for other business generated. Referral, strictly speaking, is DHS, Medicare DHS. Other business generated is everything else under the sun. Medicaid, Medicare, managed care, commercial pay, whatever. For whatever reason, CMS felt the need to have separate definitions for what takes into account the volume of value referrals, as well as what takes into account the volume of value of other business generated. And then it has separate definitions from when the compensation is coming from the physician. Now, importantly, there currently and still is a deeming rule, also called a safe harbor at 411.354 D2 and D3, for what does not take into account the volume or value of referrals or other business generated. And a lot of people have read those over the years. You had an arrangement in which, say, per unit compensation did not increase along with the number of referrals or the value of referrals, but basically stayed even. Or if you had a percentage and that percentage stayed even, then that did not take into account the volume of value of referrals. However, CMS has essentially gutted the deeming rules. It says that these deeming rules do not override the definition of what does take into account the volume of value referrals. So really, I don't see any need for them any longer. If something meets the definition, the new definition of what takes into account the volume of value referrals, then you've got a problem. And on the other hand, if it doesn't meet that definition, then you're okay. So either way, the deeming rules don't seem to have any part to play, and unfortunately, they may just create some confusion. And Larry, do you want to take over on commercial reasonableness?
Yeah, let me round out this discussion of the so-called big three: fair market value, volume or value, and commercial reasonableness. The statutory and the regulatory exceptions, as well as the anti-kickback safe harbors, have used the term commercially reasonable or commercial reasonableness for years, but it's never been defined in the statute or the regulation. It was discussed in preamble. It was discussed in detail in the 1998 proposed rule and some case law. But since it's so important to so many pieces of the exceptions that we're talking about here, CMS defined it, and I think they did a good job of it. They did it in a way that has two important parts. We've shared the whole thing here with you. The first part is the definition itself, and the second part is an important savings clause. So the new definition is pretty straightforward, that commercially reasonable means that a particular arrangement furthers the legitimate business purpose of the parties to the arrangement, the particular parties, and it is sensible considering the specific characteristics of those parties, including size, type, scope, and specialty. So this is really the catch-all that even if you have a fair market value transaction, if it's not commercially reasonable, it's not going to pass go for a lot of the exceptions that we have in the Stark rule. The second piece of this definition is also really important as it responds to some allegations and questions raised by some prosecutors regarding arrangements where a particular physician's compensation might be higher than the revenue generated by the DHS entity hiring them or the transaction in general. And CMS, I believe, has always been on board with the notion that an arrangement may still be commercially reasonable even though one party doesn't profit as much as they end up having to pay. And why would that be? Well, sometimes licensure requirements or EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, hospitals' requirements to provide charity care, desires to improve quality and health outcomes, but which don't correlate with some additional revenue to the hospital. Those all seem to us over the years representing hospitals, particularly nonprofit hospitals, but for-profit as well, to be perfectly reasonable ways to want to spend their money. And CMS has gone out of its way now to tell us we also agree that it may still be commercially reasonable even if you don't generate a profit. Now, it's worth noting that the safe harbors also use the term commercially reasonable 8 times. And CMS has said, hey, our regulation applies to the Stark rule. It does not apply to the OIG's authorities under the anti-kickback statute. There is a good discussion in the preamble to the final rule at pages 77531 to 77535 if you're interested in learning more on this. Let me move on to the next piece that is Stark only, Eric, and it's a great new exception, I think. Eric?
Well, yeah, actually, we got one more slide.
Oh, did we?
We got one more slide, Larry. One more revised definition, and that is indirect compensation arrangement. You know, in most arrangements, you're not going to have an ownership. And so you have to look to see if there's a compensation arrangement. And if you have either a direct or an indirect compensation arrangement, Stark is implicated. If you have neither, Stark is not. Now, right now, there's been a definition of indirect compensation arrangement that, quite frankly, is very complex, particularly the second element of it, which is that there has to be aggregate compensation that varies with or takes into account the volume of value. If you get to the point where you have an indirect compensation arrangement, you need the indirect compensation arrangement exception, and which also has a prohibition of taking into account the volume or value of referrals. So those two tests cannot be the same, or the only time that you would need the exception, that is because you met the definition, it wouldn't be available. But now this is quite a significant change. CMS has modified the aggregate comp test to basically include the existing language, but then say that this aggregate compensation is either not fair market value or includes physicians' referrals for DHS or other business generated, and then goes on to basically state the same test for taking into account the volume of value referrals that I discussed a few minutes ago. The upshot of this is that the good news is that it's significantly limited what constitutes an indirect compensation arrangement. The bad news is that there's really no distinction anymore between those two tests of the volume or value within the definition and within the exception. So now, if you do meet this definition of an indirect comp arrangement, you're not going to meet the exception. So this is another degree of complexity that you need to watch out for. And Eric?
Okay, thanks, Don. Yeah, so here's the new exception. This is a Stark-only exception for limited remuneration to a physician. And you'll see this theme throughout the day. This arose through CMS's administration of the voluntary self-referral disclosure protocol, whereby they became aware of numerous arrangements that don't strictly fall within an exception, but are unlikely to create any abusive. To create abuse. So this one relates to remuneration, which includes cash. So unlike the non-monetary comp and medical staff incidental benefits exception, it does include cash. And this is for for items and services. And items includes the lease of or use of office space and equipment, subject to certain restrictions. And the items or services need to be provided personally or personally by the physician or through an employee, wholly owned entity, or locums tenens. And you'll recognize this language from the PSA exception. The rationale here, and I don't know if I really buy it, but the rationale is that if physicians were permitted to provide services through an independent contractor, then the physician could enter into a service arrangement and take a fee as a middle person without providing any actual service. So here the requirements are, the volume and value, fair market value, commercially reasonable, and then, as I mentioned before, with regard to leases or use of office space, you cannot violate the prohibitions on per-click and percentage-based compensation formulas. CMS is still pretty leery of those arrangements, so they add some protections there. There's a $5,000 limit, and it's going to go up with the Consumer Price Index. And if the remuneration to the physician is conditioned on referrals, then there are safeguards to preserve patient choice. So when there are multiple arrangements, I wanted to walk through a couple of examples of how you apply this exception. So where compensation is paid under an arrangement that complies with an exception, then it is not counted towards the $5,000 limit. And if you have two or more arrangements that do not satisfy any other requirement, then CMS is going to treat it as a single arrangement, and there will be one annual $5,000 limit. You don't get to stack those. And then with regard to the interplay of this exception, suppose you have a call coverage arrangement, it's not documented, the compensation is not set in advance, and the arrangement continues. So the parties could rely on this exception up to the $5,000 limit. The parties could rely on another applicable exception, for example, fair market value, to accept the arrangement if the compensation is set in advance. And the parties could also make use of the new 90-day grace period for writing and signature requirements, again, assuming the compensation is set in advance. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Don for payments by physician.
Okay, so Stark has, as everyone knows, a lot of exceptions. Some of these exceptions, relatively few actually, are included in the statute. The rest of them are created by CMS under its statutory authority to create additional exceptions. This exception in the statute is very bare bones. It basically just includes fair market value. Doesn't include a writing requirement, doesn't have a term limit, or rather a term requirement to it, volume or value, none of that. It is very bare bones. CMS has taken the position up until the proposed rule that one could not use this exception if there were another exception on point, including the fair market value exception. Well, the fair market value exception is one that is regulatorily created, so therefore, by definition, it can't create any risk of program or patient abuse. So as you can imagine, it's got more bells and whistles to it. So that was a problem because CMS said you couldn't use the payments by physician exception. That was, quite frankly, always incorrect. Unlike a lot of statutory exceptions, there's no language in the statute that allows CMS to place additional restrictions on it. CMS finally confessed error, I would say, in the proposed rule, and so I believe that this change is really effective with the proposed rule, if not even before. Now, you can't use it in derogation of another statutory exception because it doesn't make sense that Congress would have said you have to have a signed written lease agreement that has to have a term of at least a year where the physician is the lessee, to just be able to then turn around and say, well, but we've got the payments by physician exception. So that is a limitation on it. You cannot use it in derogation of another statutory exception, but it has now really significantly opened things up by not restricting its use and not forcing to satisfy, for instance, the fair market value exception. Leads to the question as to what is the continued viability of the timeshare arrangement exception that came about in 2016. That is not a lease. In fact, one of the conditions of that exception says that it cannot be a leasehold exception. And it has other requirements to it. It restricts the services that can be done in that area, for instance, and there's a lot of technical requirements to it. Is that you ought to be able to use the payments by a physician exception, and that the timeshare exception should pretty much be dead. And with that, I think Rachel's up next.
Absolutely. So this was an interesting addition. This was not part of the proposed rules. So this was new to the final rule. And this codified the 2009 policy that was a reversal. It relates to deeming provisions for set in advance, where historically prior to 2009, in order for compensation to be set in advance, it could not, generally speaking, change within the initial year unless you entered into a new arrangement. This has kind of blown the walls off of that and codified the 2009 policy, but made it even more broad, such that you can now a compensation arrangement at any time during the term, as long as the amendment is in writing. It's prospective, so you can't change retroactively any compensation. And unlike the 2009 policy, it doesn't even require that the new arrangement be in place for a year. So this is, a pretty significant deal in terms of flexibility. And, they reiterate that you can modify the compensation as many times as you'd like during the term of an arrangement, as long as it's always done prospectively. So something that's kind of important to think about, though, and I'll talk about this more in a few minutes when I discuss another new provision, but if you were to be using the new 90-day extension for a writing requirement and wanted to modify the compensation during that period before you had assigned writing, you would not be able to kind of double dip and use that exception. You must have a writing before the services are provided and the compensation is paid. Thankfully, you don't need assigned writing, so you would still, have the rest of that 90-day period in order to get it into assigned writing. But it's an important thing to note, and this is an important modification that I think will add more flexibility going forward. But with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn to talk about the period of disallowance.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So when Stark is implicated, if there is an exception, rather there's no exception that is met, then there's two prohibitions. The physician cannot refer DHS to the entity, and the entity cannot bill for it. That period of time in which that non-compliant financial relationship exists is known as the period of disallowance. There were deeming provisions that were put in place in 2008 to give parties the knowledge that there would not be, that the period of disallowance would not end any later than a particular period of time. And the ink was not even dry on those provisions when CMS got a lot of questions about that. People never seemed to, or at least some people never seemed to get the idea that it was only a provision. So CMS proposed to abolish the, and it finalized that in the final rule. So that by itself is not a problem. However, the rest of the discussion on period of disallowance in the preamble and the one regulatory change is sort of a mixed bag. I've always taken the position that the arrangement is the arrangement. That's what the parties agree on. And if there is a mistake in the execution of that arrangement, either intentional or deliberate, that's not the arrangement. So for instance, let's say you have a hospital that is leasing space to a physician, and the physician either innocently or not so innocently pays the wrong amount of rent, or I've seen this a number of times where the physician group helps itself to additional space in a medical office building leased by the hospital. That is not the arrangement. And when the hospital discovers that to be the case, there's not a Stark violation at that point. However, if the hospital, in my example, doesn't make at least a good faith effort to cover that compensation that it should have been paid, then financial relationship in the form of a forgiveness of debt, aka a gift, and there's no Stark exception that is going to protect that. CMS recognizes that to a certain extent, but not completely in the final rule. In response to comments that criticized the proposed rule by saying that you had to fix an error by the end of the arrangement, when you might not even have discovered it until later or until the very end of it, CMS now gives a 90-day period in which to fix that. However, the error may not have been discovered until after that period of time. And also, CMS says essentially that you have to get the money back. And in response to comments that say, well, that's not always possible to do, for instance, the physician may have a legitimate or thinks he or she has a legitimate complaint about the lease arrangement, that the landlord is not living up to its obligations under the lease, or for whatever reason can't or won't pay the compensation back to the hospital. CMS essentially says, well, that's too bad. And by the way, you can use the isolated transactions exception, CMS says, to arrive at a compromise, and that's done all the time. Well, it's done a lot of the time. It's not done all the time, because sometimes you're not able to get the parties to agree on something. So the long and short of it is that this is really, I think, problematic in some areas. I know I must get asked several times each year about arrangements where there's been errors in the execution of them. And now this can, in some instances, really change the ways that the parties have to deal with it, and can create some non-compliance, whereas before the non-compliance, at least in my view, did not exist. And I think we're back to Rachel.
Yes. So sticking with the theme of adding additional flexibilities, there's a new, with this final rule, 90-day extension period for obtaining a writing, and that's both a writing and a signature. There's also the deletion of the former 90-day flexibility for obtaining signatures, as this one is broader. So that's no longer in 411.353G. This allows for parties up to 90 days to have both a writing and a signature. However, I'll point out that, similar to what I was talking about a few minutes ago, it's a deeming provision. And also, it does not negate the need for many of our exceptions that require set in advance. So regardless of whether you have a signed writing at the time or during this 90-day period, you still need objective, verifiable documentation that exists concurrent with entering into the arrangement that allows someone to objectively verify that the compensation was, in fact, set in advance. So that is an important limitation, though this will add, significant flexibility where parties are looking to enter into an arrangement right away, but the attorneys may not have gotten everything, signed up in writing yet. Also, something that's important to think about, not to get caught in a trap, is if an arrangement terminates prior to the end of the 90-day period, that doesn't mean no harm, no foul. You don't have to worry about it because you didn't exceed the 90 days. That actually would not prevent the Stark violation for that initial 90-day period. You would still be required to have a writing. However, I will point out, and this may come up quite a bit as we go, Eric talked about this new, kind of more broad fair market value exception for these limited payments of up to $5,000. There is the opportunity that without the writing, you could be protected under that new exception. But again, this does provide a lot of additional flexibility. And I think that it will be something that really helps with flexibility and entering into new arrangements for parties going forward. Another important change that makes a lot of sense in my opinion is that the definition of designated health services was actually narrowed to exclude from that definition the referral for DHS for inpatient services where the services are ordered after the DRG has already been assigned, are not separately payable, and will not result in any increased payments to the hospital by CMS. But to the extent it would result in an outlier payment, that will still be an issue. So just by way of example, to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, this would be where a physician other than the admitting physician ordered, let's just say, an x-ray after the patient had been admitted and the DRG had already been assigned. That's not going to have any impact. Therefore, that referral by that physician for an x-ray, which would otherwise be considered a referral that might be restricted if there's not an exception that applies to that physician's compensation arrangement with the hospital, will not be a prohibited referral for purposes of the Stark law. I'll also note that this has limited application to acute care hospitals, rehabilitation, inpatient rehabilitation, inpatient long-term care, and inpatient psychiatric hospitals. It does not apply to OPPS. Another thing that I just think is interesting that I want to point out is in the discussion in the final rule about this, there was some questions about, well, how are we going to know if it leads to an outlier payment? And this is going to create a lot of problems for us being able to track it. And basically CMS's response was, too bad, so sad. You should have a compliance program that helps you to identify the types of prohibited referrals at the outset. And therefore, we're not that worried about it. So they did not look at that comment very kindly. Moving on from there, this is an exception that in my practice I utilize a lot. I think that it is very important to business transactions generally, and something that maybe some parties look over too often, which is the isolated financial transactions exception. With the final rule, there was a revision both to the definition and a movement kind of the definition from being within the definition of transaction to being a new definition for isolated financial transactions that's separate. They also did revise the transaction definition, as well as kind of corresponding revisions to the isolated transactions exception, both to align with the new definition as well as to better align with the statute. With respect to kind of what specifically changed is they made very clear that this cannot be used to cure retroactive payments for repeated services. So they see a great amount of risk of people trying to use this isolated transaction exception to kind of cure what that new $5,000 exception might cure, which is failure to enter into a written agreement, failure to make payments, timely, and therefore no exception that could protect an arrangement. So they've made very clear that they consider this one transaction. They've made a change to the definition that says that this is one transaction. The way that they think about that is this is something you can only do once, if at all. So you can only sell a piece of property once. You can only sell your practice once. You can only settle a dispute once. Those are all examples that they use. Those are not, it's not restricted to those three items. And the settlement of a dispute was added to clarify that that's one of the things that they do consider an isolated transaction. And I personally have used this exception for those in the past. Also, the dispute settlement, though, they point out it does not protect the underlying financial arrangement. So if there's been an underlying financial arrangement to the parties of the dispute, and payments between them, this, just because it cures the final payment, will not protect all the prior payments. You'll need a separate exception for that. And then also to kind of drive home the fact that this cannot protect payments for multiple services over time with one single payment, they revised the definition of transaction to remove the phrase "or processes." To make clear, as some parties thought that that meant that it could be various services. So again, this is adding flexibility. I think this goes a long way to make the isolated transactions exception kind of more user-friendly and a little bit more clear of how to use it for those that may not have used it in the past. It keeps in place the the ability also to do kind of repeated payments under a promissory note where the payment's guaranteed, it's immediately negotiable. So again, this has been a good change. Next, there was a decision not to adopt a proposed change related to payments by a hospital unrelated to DHS. So this is something that's been discussed over the years. This would be a situation where payments by a hospital to a physician that might otherwise implicate Stark and require an exception would be deemed not to, because they're unrelated to the provision of DHS. In the final rule, they gave some good examples of what these things might be. Things like the purchase of office furniture by a hospital from a physician, even if that physician then comes to work for a hospital, payment for meals or other stipend for a board member that happens to be a physician, if being a physician isn't kind of a qualification of being a board member, and other roles and payments for those roles that don't require that the person be a physician. Unfortunately, despite the fact that it looked like they were going to adopt this and create this exception from compensation arrangements for these types of payments unrelated to provision of designated health services, the commenters basically expressed a concern that there wasn't, kind of clear enough guidance on what was considered unrelated to the provision of DHS, and therefore they decided not to adopt this new policy, and instead are kind of kicking the can down the road. They say that they will continue to consider how they can kind of better implement this. Next, before I turn it back over to Dawn for a moment, were some changes to ownership and investment interests, definitions and things that will not be considered ownership or investment interests. So the first one, and this is extremely relevant, particularly for a friendly PC type model where you have a PC owner that is not able to get kind of the financial benefits of owning a healthcare business. In those types of situations where the owner is owner in title only and does not have the ability to profit off of that ownership or receive distributions, for instance, then it will not be considered a ownership or investment interest that requires the Stark exception. Second is they decided that, similar to prior exceptions from ownership and investment related to retirement plans, that the owning of an entity, even through a parent of a healthcare business to which you're an employee through an employee stock ownership plan that's qualified under IRS Section 401A, is not going to be considered a ownership or investment interest for which an exception would be required for DHS referrals, because the, kind of lengthy, if you've ever dealt with ESOPs, statutory and regulatory requirements that are required for an ESOP under the IRS code and ERISA, among other things. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Dawn to talk about directive referrals.
Thanks, Rachel. So for many years, there's been a safe harbor in 411-354-D4, and that allows an entity to basically require its employed physicians or even contracted physicians to refer to a certain entity, which naturally would be itself in many instances, subject to certain limitations. And this was just a way of guarding against any claim that the arrangement impermissibly took into account the volume of value referrals. So, for instance, the requirements were the arrangement had to be set in advance, the compensation was consistent with fair market value, otherwise satisfied an exception. All those requirements are typically in another exception anyway. And then also if the patient expressed a particular preference for a different supplier or the insurance required it, and so forth and so on. Well, now that's no longer just a safe harbor that's there. CMS has converted this into an affirmative requirement in several of the exceptions. For instance, the exceptions for employments, personal service arrangements, fair market value comp, and indirect compensation arrangement. So it does not require that this be in a writing. In fact, of course, the employment exception doesn't require a writing to begin with. But best practices would say that if you're going to have a directed referral requirement, that you put those requirements into a writing and really call attention to those requirements. If you don't comply with what used to be all the components of a safe harbor, you're now not in compliance with one of these exceptions. So this is a very important change. And in addition to the 5 existing or pre-existing requirements, CMS has added this one, which is kind of interesting. It says that you can't tell a physician that he or she has to refer a certain number of referrals, or that the referrals have to have a certain value as part of the directed referral arrangement, but you can require that the physician refer a certain percentage or a certain ratio of the physician's referrals to the particular entity. And I think we're going back to Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Don. So another significant change, and one that we kind of is more broadly changed, we don't go into a lot today, are changes to profit sharing and productivity bonuses under the group practice definition. There were a number of changes. I think most importantly, I will point out that they, because of the nature of physician compensation and disrupting kind of annual compensation schedules and the timing of this rule, they have pushed this off to go into effect until January 1st, 2022. So that's the good news. But one of the important clarifications that CMS has stated that they are finalizing, a long-held interpretation that they've had, is that there cannot be service-based pooling of designated health services if you want to be or satisfy the group practice definition. So this means that if you are currently pooling, your pet revenue separate from your lab and distributing it, even if you're doing it to pods of 5 or more that seems compliant, it's not permitted. There have been changes to the language of the profit share portion of the group practice definition that make very clear that all of the revenue must be aggregated for all DHS. Prior to being distributed either to all physicians or to subsets of 5 or more. They added kind of some additional color about how you can do those subsets, I think trying to take away some of the sting of this by saying, you can do the subsets based on specialty, you can do the subsets based on referral patterns, similar years of experience, location, et cetera. But for any practices that do have this kind of separately service-by-service pool of DHS compensation, there will be significant changes starting, at least on January 1st, 2022, to your compensation. Also, because we didn't hit it at the beginning when we had our value-based discussion, I want to point out that there has been a change to the group practice definition to allow for compensation and still be a group practice, really, that directly relates to the referral of DHS with respect to a value-based arrangement. So I think that that's going to be a significant change. The commentary is pretty interesting in their kind of direct tie to referrals. So I wanted to point that out as well. But then I will turn it over to Eric regarding fair market value and space leases.
So this is another example of CMS basically changing its mind following review of many self-disclosures. So now office space is considered an item now. So it's protected under the fair market value exception, specifically with regard to leases. So just a reminder, leases and rentals in Stark, they mean the same thing. It means the transfer of dominion and control over property, whereas just use of office space is something else, and this fair market value cannot be used for merely use of office space. So under the fair market value exception, the parties, they can enter into only one lease arrangement for the rental of the same office space during the course of a year, but they can renew the terms and conditions of that lease any number of times. And then just a reminder, and because it's fun, the payments by a physician exception that Don talked about at 357I, it cannot protect a lease for office space, but can protect space can protect a lease for space which is not office space, and the PSA exception cannot protect leases because office space is not a service, it is an item. So here, this is an interesting one. CMS deleted the requirement in the regulatorily created exceptions that the arrangements don't violate anti-kickback statute or any federal or state regulation governing billing and claim submission. So this is an effort to quote unquote decouple Stark law from the anti-kickback statute and other laws governing billing or claim submission. So as Larry mentioned, Stark is a strict liability statute, whereas the anti-kickback statute is intent-based. So the inclusion of the requirement to comply with the anti-kickback statute, it was a little bit of an oddity because it introduced an intent-based statute into a strict liability statute. And it was odd also because it created in litigation some oddities with regard to the burden of proof. So regardless of whether the anti-kickback standard is stated, the parties still remain subject to anti-kickback statute and other laws, regardless of whether they comply with Stark. So here, the requirement that the arrangement does not violate anti-kickback statute has been deleted from all of the regulatorily created exceptions except fair market value. The fair market value exception was initially created as kind of an open-ended exception to address, many common and legitimate compensation arrangements. CMS decided to keep the AKS requirement in that one exception just as an important substitute safeguard because it doesn't have a lot of safeguards that are listed in other exceptions. So I'm going to turn it back to Larry.
Thanks, Eric. While we're talking about changes that CMS is making to the Stark regulations, a number of them, including the next one I'm going to talk about, are really good examples of CMS trimming out what is some needless complexity that has built up in the regs over the years. One of them is particularly useful for laboratories and physicians who rely on receiving specimen collection cups, transportation, processing, test ordering. All of these are statutory carve-outs from the definition of remuneration, so that when a DHS entity furnishes these items, devices, or supplies for use solely for one of those 6 statutory purposes, it's not remuneration. And if it's not remuneration, then Stark doesn't apply. Well, HCFA, Healthcare Financing Administration, the predecessor to CMS, grafted in a not including surgical items, devices, and supplies to this carve-out from the definition of remuneration. And this created a lot of challenging line-drawing exercises, resulted in 2 advisory opinions, one favorable, one unfavorable. So in looking at that and trying to clean it up, CMS offered 2 useful changes. The first is they removed that limitation that these items or devices can't include surgical items, devices, or supplies. And they also added in a notion of, is the service in fact used solely for one of those 6 statutory purposes, allowing things that might have some other use in addition to those 6 items, but if they're in fact only used for one of those purposes, it'll still be okay to be provided by a DHS entity without triggering the definition of remuneration, thus causing one of the exceptions to have to be met. Now, I don't think this should be viewed as opening the floodgates for provision of more expensive technologies from DHS entities to physicians and physician organizations. CMS stresses in the preamble that the items still are principally useful for the entity that's providing it, not for the physician. It's supposed to have little or no independent value to the physician herself. They also reminded us or warned us that even if you satisfy Stark and have a carve-out from this definition of remuneration for the Stark purposes, the anti-kickback statute may still apply. Rachel, walk us through some of the changes to NPP recruitment.
Absolutely. So for the final topic I'll be covering with you this morning, revisions to the exception for remuneration provided to a non-physician practitioner. This is a relatively new exception. It only came out in 2016. And similar to what I've been talking about a lot. This is, again, kind of an expansion of the ability to use the exception as well as some clarifications. The first major change was that rather than talking about patient care services within the exception, which is really a defined term with respect to physicians within the Stark Law and didn't make a lot of sense for this exception, they have redefined or created a new term called named NPP services. So this is actually services provided by a non-physician practitioner, such as a nurse practitioner of any of the varieties, as well as a physician assistant. In terms of kind of the impact of this change, kind of the importance comes in when you look at an exception that's been created from the prohibition of using this exception where the NPP has provided services within the geographic service area of the hospital, providing the compensation to the physician within the last year. This basically allows for practitioners that were not yet licensed as NPPs, so let's say a RN that's studying to become a nurse practitioner, if they provided services within that service area in the prior year, just because they provided services in that service area, because they weren't rising to the level of NPP services, since they weren't licensed as such at that time, the prohibition related to the prior 1 year will not apply, and the money would still be appropriately transferred from the hospital to the physician with respect to the recruitment and payment of that non-physician practitioner. Another important clarification is there were questions about whether or not this could be used for existing NPPs, for hospitals to support payments to existing NPPs, and they clarified that no, this is really meant to be for recruitment purposes. And so the arrangement that is entered into between the physician and the hospital, FQHC or RHC, with respect to kind of these payments to supplement the payments to the NPP, this must be entered into prior to the arrangement being entered into with the NPP. So again, it's both creating clarifications as well as creating some new use cases for this exception that I think providers will find useful. And with that, I will turn it over to Eric for some clarifications related to leasing.
So we're in the leasing space and rental equipment exceptions here, and the change here is that for these exceptions, they're now being clarified to provide that the only party that must be excluded from using the space or equipment is the lessor. So the exclusive use requirement, it was originally intended to prevent sham or paper leases, whereby the lessee was making payments to the lessor, even though the lessee wasn't even using the space or was permitting the lessor to use it. So in other words, the lessor was getting the benefit of both the space and the payment. You know, that's not okay. And there are multiple disclosures to the SRDP that included arrangements where multiple lessees were using the same rented office space or equipment, either contemporaneously or in close succession with the other, while the lessor was excluded from using the premises or equipment. That's not a sham, no harm, no foul. So CMS has created this clarification to state the same. The next slide is with regard to the recruitment exception. So under prior law, if the recruited physician joined a physician practice, then the exception required one agreement signed by all three parties. So now the physician practice has to sign the recruitment agreement only if it receives a financial benefit under the agreement. So what is a financial benefit? So I guess I'll tell you what it's not. If the hospital pays the physician directly, then the physician practice is not getting any benefit. Or if the hospital is paying the physician practice and the practice is passing through all of the remuneration to the recruited physician, there is no financial benefit. So in either of those cases, it's not necessary for the physician practice to sign. There's no fraud to protect against, or there's no abuse to protect against, and it reduces the burdens of the parties. Okay, so the next couple of clarifications relate to the collection of writings and and signature requirements. So first, the collection of writings that the parties may rely on to satisfy the writing requirement can include documents and records that are stored electronically. I think that's pretty straightforward, and that's consistent with CMS's policy. Second, another clarification that's consistent with CMS's policy, but now it's codified, is that in electronic signature, as long as it's legally valid under state or federal law, it's sufficient to satisfy the signature requirement. So that could include, where you type or print a name in an email and then send that. If that's allowable under state or federal law, then it's allowable for STARK purposes. Adam, can you talk about the third bullet point?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And even before there, I just want to chime in on that electronic signature issue as well. I mean, I think that's one that's frequently arisen for clients when they're particularly trying to piece together disparate documentation to meet the elements of a STARK exception. Sometimes the question is, how do you get to the signature piece? And I think it's great that CMS has sort of agreed with the position that I think advocates in the community have long held, that there's a lot of ways to get to the signature piece, and it doesn't have to be a wet handwritten signature, but it can be something like the types of examples that you were just stating, Eric. So on this third point, this is about a clarification of pass-throughs in equal exchanges of value, and CMS just made it clear that these do not constitute a financial relationship for purposes of STARK. And the examples here are pretty straightforward. We have some of them on the slide. A $10 gift card that's the equivalent of $10 in cash, or a physician entity that's purely a pass-through, that's just getting something from one entity to another. The thing to call out here is that CMS just warns that this pass-through and equal exchanges of value is not a way to get around prohibitions on certain types of in-kind payments. An in-kind payment to an entity for cash is still going to create a financial relationship, which of course should be completely reasonable, because otherwise, a physician providing something like his or her own medical services, you could say is just a exchange of equal value. Okay, so we're going to move on to I think one final STARK exception or clarification before the next section. And this is the removal of the Medicaid from language in the definition of overall profits of the group in the group practice definition. And basically CMS is saying Medicaid income should not be counted here. This is really a attempt to clean up what seems to have just been an oversight or a mistake. CMS noted that this inclusion of Medicaid seems to have been a holdover from way back in a 1998 proposed rule that was never finalized. It was associated with other aspects of that rule that didn't get finalized. As we know, the definition of DHS itself does not include Medicaid, so it's always been a little bit of an oddity to have Medicaid here. So to sort of clean up that mistake from back in those older rulemakings, they've just removed the definition of Medicaid from from this definition. And now we're going to just really quickly turn back to Dawn for a discussion of the set and advance changes before coming back to some other AKS only exceptions. Oh, actually, this is the CLE code, so I'll pause there for the CLE code.
Thanks, Adam. At this time, I will announce the first CLE code. For those seeking CLE credit today, please type the following code into the box on your screen and hit the submit button. The CLE code is HGZDJ. Again, that's H as in Hank, G as in girl, Z as in zebra, D as in dog, and J as in Joe. We will leave the box open briefly. One more time, the code is HGZDJ. Thank you. And then give that 15 seconds, and then I'll turn it back over to Dawn.
Did you say HD, Z as in zebra, DJ, or V as in Victor?
I did.
DJ.
I'll repeat it one more time. H
Thanks.
as in Hank, G as in girl, Z as in zebra, D as in dog, and J as in Joe.
Thanks. And for some folks who are asking questions in the chat window, this is the first time you've been asked to enter a CLE code, so you didn't miss anything. And we've been talking about the Stark-only changes. We're about to move on, I believe, to AKS changes and safe harbors.
That's right.
All right, well, thanks so much. Again, that's HGVDJ. And Don, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Okay.
And are you also, you're going to put that code in, I think you put the code in the chat window so that folks can see it. Is that right, Maggie? Maggie,
No,
why don't you do that? Are you allowed to do that?
We are not allowed to do that, so let me say it one more time. It's H as in Hank, G as in girl, Z as in zebra, D as in dog, and J as in Joe.
Thanks. If you've got to sit through 2 hours of us, you might as well at least get CLE credit for it.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we're into the last segment of our presentation, and these are provisions that deal with the AKS only. So the first one is really potentially very important, and I'll explain the potential part in a minute. So there's always been a disconnect between the AKS safe harbor for personal services and management contracts and the Stark exception for PSAs. They're very similar requirements, including the set and advance requirement, but the OIG has always taken a position that it wants to be able to look at the written agreement and tell just from the face of that how much the agent is getting paid over the course of the year. Whereas CMS always had a policy that formulaic compensation was good enough. The OIG has now adopted that approach and says that formulaic compensation is good enough. That's the good news. The potential bad news or uncertain news is that it still has the requirement in the safe harbor that the compensation can't take into account the volume or value of referrals. And the OIG has not given any guidance on what its test is for taking into account the volume or value of referrals, and refused to give any guidance in response to commenters on that. But under any definition of what it means to take into account the volume of value referrals, if you have incentive compensation to a physician that is based purely on quality metrics and patient satisfaction, such as you're likely to see in a co-management agreement, that arrangement now, assuming that it's fair market value, should be able to meet the safe harbor. Well, what about gain sharing arrangements? The comment came in and asked OIG to clarify that paying physicians a percentage of savings was not taking into account the volume of value of referrals, because more cases could mean more savings or more cases could mean more losses. The OIG declined to answer that, but I'm going to read you this language from the preamble. Excuse me. It says, properly structured arrangements that compensate physicians for services performed and achieve hospital internal cost savings can serve legitimate business and medical purposes depending on specific facts and circumstances. Such arrangements could potentially be structured in a manner that complies with paragraph 1001-952D1 as finalized. Well, I've never seen a gain sharing arrangement that doesn't pay a percentage of the savings. So this language may be tantamount to saying that your traditional gain sharing arrangement may now comply with a safe harbor, which begs the question, what happens to the safeguards that are in the various advisory opinions on gain sharing, such as the need for rebasing and caps on the number of procedures? Unless the OIG somehow backs into those requirements by construing them related to the volume or value of referrals, this may mean that gain sharing arrangements now can comply with a safe harbor, and that is very important news. And then just briefly, the second bullet here is that the former version, which has now been changed to the safe harbor, said that where the agreement is for a periodic, sporadic, or part-time basis, the agreement specifies exactly the schedule of such intervals, their precise length, and the exact charge. That has always been, a pain in the neck. And really, what is a periodic management agreement? What's a sporadic or a part-time management agreement? That's always been uncertain. So that requirement is now gone, and that's welcome. So I think we're now on to Adam.
Yes, thanks, Don. And I'm going to talk about the new safe harbor for outcomes-based payments here, which is actually sort of created as an extension of the personal services safe harbor. It's kind of nestled underneath it at this new D2. And it's also kind of relevant to some of the comments Don was just making, because this is another potential way to protect some gain sharing arrangements or arrangements with shared savings or shared losses. And the OIG, in creating this new safe harbor, recognize that these types of arrangements can facilitate care coordination and encourage provider engagement. So we're just going to go into a few elements of the safe harbor in a little bit more detail here. So first, the payment can either be a reward for achieving or a recoupment or reduction in payment for failure to achieve an outcome measure. So you can structure it either way. One of the keys here, though, is that there has to be an outcome measure and it has to be achieved. These outcome-based payments can be between or among parties that are collaborating to either measurably improve or maintain improvement in quality of patient care, or appropriately and materially reduce costs or growths and expenditures while improving or maintaining the quality of care. So what to say here is that there has to be a quality of care dimension. The outcomes-based payment safe harbor is not available for something that's purely about cost savings, but does not take into account the quality of care. The protection, however, is not limited to any particular types or structures of arrangements. And so there is some ability to think broadly about how to use this. But the OIG, did stress that if your arrangement isn't focused on quality, you should be looking to other potential protections, such as the personal services safe harbor at D1. So here is just a list of all of the elements of this new outcome-based payment safe harbor. You'll see that some of them are very familiar. They're identical or, substantially identical to other safe harbor elements. And some are new, created just for this particular safe harbor. And one thing to just point sort of as a theme, we've talked on and off today about, the efforts of these changes to, on the one hand, give more flexibility to the provider community and to reduce certain burdens. But on the other hand, as I think Larry teed up very accurately in the beginning, in some cases there's a lot of detail and sort of a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through to take advantage of these new flexibilities. And I think this safe harbor is really a great example of that because it is this new protection. But if you look here, there's this whole list of elements that need to be met to take advantage of it. And it could be relatively easy to get tripped up by missing one or more of these elements. So to focus on the first one, the legitimate outcome measure, in some ways this is the most interesting and the most unique about this safe harbor. There has to be an outcome measure that's selected based on clinical evidence or credible medical support. And it's supposed to have benchmarks that are related to quality of care or a reduction in costs while maintaining quality of care or both. And kind of amusingly to me here, some of the language changed between the proposed rule and the final rule describing this legitimate outcome measure element. Originally, the OIG had proposed that the outcome measure had to be evidence-based and valid. And they swapped that with this language about based on clinical evidence and legitimate. And, I think to a layperson, you might think that those sound roughly comparable, but in their comments, they indicated that they thought that this was giving the provider community additional flexibility I guess the idea is that something based on clinical evidence is a little bit of a looser term than something that's evidence-based. So some of the other requirements here are the same as the personal services and management contracts, but there's still a prohibition on taking into account the value or volume of referrals. In this exception, it says directly taking into account, and it doesn't have that directly or indirectly language. And so that's a signal that there's a little bit of more flexibility on that front here if there really is an outcome that's being achieved. And another thing to point out is that there's not a requirement to achieve the outcome on any specified timeline. There were a lot of questions about that, but the view of the OIG is that timelines can vary, and depending on the type of outcome that's selected, it may be appropriate to have one that's shorter or lengthier in time. I'm just going to advance the slides here. So I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, but the outcome has to be achieved. So that's important. You can't have an outcomes-based payment safe harbor where you make the payment just because someone tried to achieve the outcome but failed to get there. On the other hand, the types of outcomes that OIG discusses may be broader than you might think. So some of these are things that are, I think, what would first come to mind, like say a percentage reduction in admissions, or a very clear target like that. But they also talk about sort of getting a certain percentage of your patients to hit clinical guidelines. For instance, getting a colonoscopy at the time that they're supposed to get the colonoscopy, and outcomes like that. So they're all able to be quantified and measured, but they're not. Sometimes they include measures that are. There's good evidence that they relate to improved health outcomes over the long term, but they may not directly have to do with avoiding a particular health outcome in the short term. And then this outcomes-based payment safe harbor has certain exclusions. One is that it can't be just about cost savings. We've already mentioned that. And it also can't be just about patient satisfaction or patient convenience. But the other one is that it excludes payments made by a list of entities. And this is the same list of entities that are excluded from many of the new AKS safe harbors. So it should become a pretty familiar list if you start working with these exceptions. So that was outcome-based payments. Now I'm going to turn to another new AKS safe harbor, which is the patient engagement and support safe harbor, or as I think OIG described it in the rule, the arrangements for patient engagement and support to improve quality, health outcomes, and efficiency. So this is an important new safe harbor because it protects remuneration to a patient, but it's tied back to those same value-based enterprise terms and definitions that we've discussed at the beginning of the presentation. So the remuneration has to go from a value-based enterprise participant to a patient who is in the target population of that value-based enterprise. And it can be furnished either directly or through an eligible agent. One point there is that we're going to get some of the same exclusions on who is eligible to use the safe harbor, and you cannot just merely avoid those exclusions by making an ineligible entity into your agent. That would not be permissible. And these sorts of patient engagement and support payments have to be directly connected to the coordination and management of care of the target patient, and they have to be recommended by the patient's healthcare professional for the purpose of advancing a clinical goal. So these are going to limit the types of support that can be provided. And then, a very critical limitation, which I think is going to be important as people think about using the safe harbor, is that the aggregate retail value can't exceed $500 per patient per year. And it's only in-kind support, so you can't provide cash or cash equivalents. So one interesting change to the safe harbor from the proposed rule to the final rule is that there were originally some illustrative examples, and the OIG stripped them out because they really wanted to be agnostic about the types of in-kind tools and supports that can be protected by this safe harbor if the conditions are met. So, that's always sort of a double-edged sword. It means there's a little bit less guidance directly in the regulation, but I think it also means that the provider community can be confident that there's supposed to be flexibility here with how to use this. And one point that was really interesting about this safe harbor is that the OIG actually really characterized it and in some of its comments as a way to address the social determinants of health. And this has really been a hot topic sort of in the healthcare community over the last few years. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, the CDC defines the social determinants of health as the conditions in the places where people live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of health and quality of life risks and outcomes. So basically, these are mostly non-medical factors that are extremely important to health, like housing and neighborhood safety and food security, education, and economic stability. And so there's been a big push to address these factors because we know from research that they're really very closely tied to actual health outcomes, probably actually much more tied to health outcomes than medical care in many instances. But, my take, I think, looking at this is that this is, while this is a limited mechanism to address those factors, it's not going to be really a silver bullet, or it's not going to go all the way that the provider community wants, because the scale of what you can do with this safe harbor just doesn't match the scale of the problem that's faced that you're trying to solve when you address social determinants of health. And I think just to make this more concrete, I've worked with a lot of healthcare providers that are really concerned with patients who are experiencing homelessness. They tend to, have worse health outcomes and to really drive up costs. They spend a lot of time in the emergency department, and they have difficulty adhering to treatment and care programs. And that's sort of a critical social determinants of health problem that they're going without housing. But this safe harbor is not going to do very much to address that, because $500 per year is clearly not going to get someone in housing for the year. But the OIG does provide a lot of examples of more modest things that could be done to address these social determinants. And so it's worth thinking about some of those. They mention in-kind transportation, like transit vouchers or ride shares, home modifications to make your home safer to live in. That could be grab bars, air filters, purifiers, some other sort of small physical or structural modifications. Other examples are providing some broadband access for patients to enable remote patient monitoring or virtual care, grocery or meal delivery services, nutrition supplements, nutrition education, exercise or fitness programs, and vehicle modifications. And then a really interesting one is they also talk about some incentives for addiction recovery programs, including peer-to-peer programs and contingency management programs or mental health programs. And that's always been, a huge issue for patients is, trying to get them to adhere to some of these programs that we know would be good for their health. So this is a safe harbor to explore if you're engaged in a value-based enterprise and trying to target some of these high utilization, high risk patients and find ways to improve the quality of the patient care. And I guess one other thing to note on this topic, sort of putting this safe harbor in the context of some of the other value-based enterprise safe harbors we discussed at the beginning, is it doesn't require any assumption of financial risk to utilize it. So I think, Rachel and Larry talked about that way at the front here, how some of the new exceptions and safe harbors rely on assuming financial risk and others don't. Well, this is one that doesn't rely on that. Just advance here. This is just showing that just like the other safe harbors we were discussing, there are a range of entities that are ineligible to use it, which are the same ones that are in many of the others. I guess one quick note here, though, is that manufacturers of devices or medical supplies are generally not permitted to use the safe harbor, but there's an interesting exception for digital health technology, because the OIG sees a special sort of critical role for digital health technology and improving coordination and patient management. Okay, now the last thing I want to turn to is the new safe harbor for CMS-sponsored model arrangements. And I think this can go pretty quickly. It's basically just making the sort of scatter different exceptions that are safe harbors that have been created on an ad hoc basis into a more unified format in this new exception that would apply to all of these model arrangements. And what we mean by model arrangements are either models under 1115A of the Social Security Act, which is what the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation models, and then also the Medicare Share Savings programs. So a lot of these, the elements here would be sort of the same as what have already been provided as fairly specific exceptions for those models. And I think that the key in discussing this new authority is that even though it's this OIG authority and it's a safe harbor to the AKS, it's really all driven by CMS. CMS decides whether the safe harbor applies. CMS decides in many cases whether they want to go beyond the sort of default rules in the safe harbor. And they're the ones running these payment models or these innovative programs, and so they're going to get to take the reins here. Just advance the slides. So this talks about some of the default standards in the universal waiver that the patient incentive is going to have. If there's a patient incentive that's being provided, it's going to have a direct connection to the patient's health care. But again, CMS can change that if they decide that it's important to do it. There are other default requirements. Is exchanged between CMS-sponsored model parties. They have to determine that it furthers the goals of the CMS arrangement. It doesn't create an incentive to furnish medically unnecessary items or care, and that they don't basically pay for referrals. Go here. There's a couple slides here about the timing. It's the quick thing there is just to say that there's a tail period when there's remuneration between participants that can be provided up to 6 months after the final payment determination made by CMS. Again, of course, CMS could change the rules. But when you go to the next slide, when you have patient incentives, that's just during the time the program is running, and then that safe harbor is no longer available. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Larry for a discussion of changes to the local transportation safe harbor.
Thanks, Adam. And, we've been having the benefit of, for the past 4 years, a new safe harbor that provides for protection of free or discounted local transportation services. A number of organizations are relying on it. And this set of changes, I think, is the OIG's, thoughtful consideration of some ways to tweak this to make it a little more useful to the community. And really, these are benefits to the individual patients more than AKS risks in terms of providers paying other providers for referrals. The AKS definitely applies to payments to beneficiaries, but so too does the civil money penalty law, which prohibits beneficiary inducements designed to induce patients to choose one provider over another. And so Adam was talking a moment ago about the new patient engagement and support services safe harbor, which I thought was really helpful. The local transportation safe harbor also, when you meet it for AKS purposes, just like patient engagement and support services Adam mentioned, provides protections against that civil money penalty law problem with regard to beneficiary inducements. So what the local transportation safe harbor has done is allowed for free or discounted local transportation, not luxury services, mostly for established patients in certain limited areas, 25 miles around a provider or within 50 miles for rural patients. What this change to the safe harbor did was did three things really. The first thing it did was it expanded the range for the rural patients from 50 miles to 75 miles, leaving aside the normal 25-mile rule intact. And this is particularly important for patients who need to travel greater distance to get specialty services like cancer care, neurology, transplant, or other services that are usually concentrated in a large hospital, often in an urban area. One of the things that people ignore when they're thinking about this local transportation is they say, well, we're not a rural hospital, we're an urban hospital. Well, remember, this safe harbor applies to where the patient lives. So that 50-mile and now 75-mile limit is available for patients who might need to come to an urban area but return home to their rural community to receive those services. So that's the first thing they did. The second thing OIG did, which is extremely helpful, is it eliminated the mileage limit entirely for transportation services designed to convey patients who are being discharged from a hospital or who were in a hospital for observation services of at least 24 hours back to their residence. And that is regardless of whether the patient is an urban patient or a rural patient. This is a limited protection for that unlimited mileage. It does not extend to other destinations, like taking a patient to post-acute care. Those are still subject to the mileage limitations. It also doesn't extend to patients who are being discharged from other provider or supplier types, like ambulatory surgery centers or hospital emergency rooms or outpatient departments, unless that's where observation services are somehow taking place, I guess. The final change they made was they clarified that the safe harbor is available for ride-sharing services. We've kicked the tire on Uber Health and a few other services. They're now explicitly permitted to be part of the safe harbor. And then there's another set of AKS safe harbors around warranties. And oftentimes this is considered a safe harbor that would only be used by a manufacturer, selling technology. But it's actually broader than that. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. In fact, what the OIG did in this change to the warranty safe harbor was designed to protect a broader scope of what the warranty might do, including warranties for one or more items, as well as related services if they meet certain conditions. It's not for warranties of services only. You need to have an item in there as well. And that's certainly worth thinking about. But it protects generally bundled warranties, which is something that historically weren't covered by the plain language of it. It's designed to protect services as well. They can be offered as part of the warranty remedy if that's part of a warranty associated with the item. They don't want to protect services only, and they definitely want this to be part of the remedy of a warranty. They're worried about it being read too broadly to allow the provision of free services unrelated to a warranty remedy. That's not what this is designed to do. But when you think about what services might be captured within a remedy under a warranty, particularly in the modern environment where we're looking at technology that's bundled with data analytics or data collection, some of those additional services can come along with a warranty in order to help verify product usage, monitor patient adherence, and the like. So I do think, and I want to remind everyone that this is, while it's often thought of as only available to device manufacturers, it's not. It's allowed to be used by more than that type of entity. And as providers and technology companies get much more involved in, as I think Adam was mentioning before, some digital health issues, and where big data are collected along with devices, these warranties provide opportunities to stand behind products and services in much more comprehensive fashion. Eric, you're up.
All right, so the last two items that we're going to cover today on the anti-kickback statute side. Number one, the final rule adopts proposed codification of a statutory exception to the definition of remuneration. This specifically relates to ACO beneficiary inducement programs and the Medicare Shared Savings Program. So under the MSSP, an ACO may furnish incentive payments to assigned beneficiaries, for example, payments to incentivize patients to attend their primary care appointments. So as long as they complies with all the other requirements in here, there's low risk of abuse, and it is likely to improve patient outcomes, reduce downstream medical expenses. So that change has been implemented. And then finally, with regard to telehealth technologies for in-home dialysis, this is a relatively narrow exception, but it codifies this exception to amend the definition of remuneration under the Civil Monetary Penalties Beneficiary Inducements Program, specifically to accept the definition of remuneration for the provision of certain telehealth technologies related to in-home dialysis services. So again, this is a relatively narrow exception to the CMP statute, and it is limited to a subset of patients receiving in-home dialysis and certain enumerated providers in the statutory exception. It requires that the technology not be offered as part of any advertisement or solicitation, which is consistent with a number of other rules in CMP, and also that the telehealth technologies are provided for the purpose of furnishing telehealth services related to end-stage renal disease. And then finally, there's a definition of telehealth technologies. It's stated there, hardware, software, services that support distant or remote communication for the diagnosis, intervention, or ongoing care management. So I think that does it for our prepared materials today. I'm going to flip it over to Dawn and Larry to moderate some questions.
Thanks, Eric, and thank all of my colleagues for putting in the effort. I hope you recognize that, well, you certainly were drinking from a fire hose for this. The folks who helped pull this together were as well. And we do hope that it will be good to move on and get our next CLE code in. I know that some of you had some troubles entering your first CLE code. Maggie might have an update on that and how we can help you. Maggie?
Thanks, Larry. Yes, if you had trouble with the first CLE code, please email me. My email is mweschler@foley.com. It should be somewhere on your resources tab, but let us know if you had any trouble and we'll make sure that we can get to you and make sure everything that you're able to get credit. At this time, we are going to do the second CLE code, which I will announce very slowly and very clearly to the best of my abilities, and I will give you more time to fill that in. The next CLE code is L9U2K. That's L as in Larry, the number 9, U as in umbrella, the number 2, and K as in king. Again, that's L as in Larry, the number 9, U as in umbrella, the number 2, and K as in king. One last time, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Larry. The second code is L as in Larry, the number 9, U as in umbrella, the number 2, and K as in king. Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And everyone, please note that you can enter questions into the Q&A feature down below. We'll try to field them. If we don't successfully get to your question, we would be happy to follow up with you afterwards. We do have a lot already teed up. Dawn, did you want to grab one to start with, or should I pick them out and distribute them?
Now go ahead, Larry. Just hand them out.
That sounds good. All right, I'm going to go back to Rachel since you're on the screen. One of the questions that we received is asking about simple medical directorship contracts, and under if at least 10% of the compensation is tied to performance metrics, so meeting the 10% at risk standard, would that safe harbor be met?
So this is a good question and gives us time to discuss some things we didn't have time for at the beginning, which is, although there's, particularly under the CMS exceptions, which this refers to, there is limited requirements for writings, particularly signed writings. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is that a value-based arrangement and a value-based enterprise, while it's something that's very loosely affiliated, doesn't require an entity, and might seem fairly easy based on what we discussed, actually requires quite a bit of planning. because you have to document in writing your value-based purposes, your value-based goals. For purposes of the anti-kickback statute, as I said earlier, the money has to directly align to those. So there's some important documentation that has to occur. And so as to this specific question, whether or not, if there was a kind of 10% at-risk amount with respect to performance metrics for medical directorship, that alone would not qualify for the CMS exception because you also need for it to be related to the value-based enterprise, the value-based purpose. You have to have your value-based enterprise kind of created and have all that kind of precursor material and governing documents set out about how it's going to run and what its goals are, what your review processes are going to be, et cetera.
That said, Rachel, I would think that just because you don't meet the new value-based exception, you may still be able to meet the personal services exception or the newly reformed personal services and management contract safe harbor for medical directors that have some at-risk component of their comp, wouldn't you?
Agreed, certainly. And, I think we pointed this out at the beginning, but I'll do it again because I think it's important, is we kind of don't know exactly where all of this is going to go and what kind of business and the stakeholders are going to create from this. But what we very much expect is that with the STARK exceptions being kind of the floor, that there's going to be a lot of arrangements that STARK protects that the safe harbors just don't protect, or you at least can't use the value-based safe harbor. And so you will have to default to something like the personal services arrangement safe harbor to cover some of those things, or some of the other new interesting safe harbors that Adam was talking about towards the end of our presentation that also relate to these value-based concepts.
Dawn, you responded to one of the questions about whether these regulations would be impacted by the change in the administration. I'm not sure if you responded to everyone on that, or just to the person who asked the question.
I'm not sure I understand how the Q&A process works. So, the question was whether we thought that the Biden administration would let these rules stand. And many of you may be aware that there was a memorandum that came out, just a day or two after the Biden administration began talking about rules and reviewing them and possibly putting some on hold. But if the rule is already out the door and it's already effective, then you need to have additional rulemaking to change that rule in any way or to rescind it. An agency is bound by its own rules. So the short answer is that unless there's further rulemaking, these rules are effective. There's that one provision that with respect to profit shares to within a group practice that Rachel spoke about, which becomes effective January 1st, 2022. But other than that, everything is effective right now. Just as a matter of philosophy, I don't think that the Biden administration, if the past is prologue, is going to have any real problem with these rules. Both the Democratic and the Republican administrations late have been moving towards value-based purchasing. And as far as the weeds are concerned with Stark, they don't get involved in that at that level. So the short answer is I don't foresee any changes to these rules simply based because there's the new administration. But Larry, while I've got the mic, if I could, I'd like to respond to another question that came in. And the question is, what if your agreement specifically provides for a reconciliation period that happens to be more than 90 days? I think that's in response to the segment I was discussing on the period of disallowance. If that is built into the compensation arrangement in such a manner that allows the arrangement to be modified, or that the compensation is not final under certain circumstances, you get the benefit of an additional period. To give you an analogy, I often review compensation arrangements with physicians, let's say it's an employment agreement, and they're paid or supposed to be paid in such a way that doesn't take into account the volume value of referrals. And if it's a group practice, it may provide in such a way that they're supposed to be paid in a manner that doesn't directly take into account the volume of value referrals. One of the things that I do when I review these is recognizing that mistakes can be made, is to suggest to the client that they have a provision right in the compensation arrangement that says if you are paid by mistake in a manner that directly takes into account the volume of value of referrals, or if it's not a group practice that would say, directly or indirectly, you agree that the practice can recoup this money, and you can provide further detail on that. So that really provides a compensation arrangement that, on the one hand, that has certain provisions giving compensation, but then reserves the right to take it back or to modify it. And if that is done within the arrangement itself, then that's just part of the arrangement. And I don't see that this is a reconciliation outside of that arrangement. It's a reconciliation within that arrangement. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks. Adam, I want to turn to you. We got a good question relating to your discussion of outcome-based payments, the new safe harbor. And specifically, the question is, how would fair market value be determined for payments based on outcomes? Do you have any thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. This is a really good question, and it's one that a lot of commentators actually raised because, unlike something like a salary survey where you can turn to sort of established evidence, it's not as clear what you would look at to decide, what the fair market value for an outcome-based payment is. So I think this is one of those good news, bad news ones where the good news is there seems to be a lot of flexibility. The bad news is there's no clear answer. I'm just going to read you a statement that the OIG made in response to these questions. They say, we recognize that the process of evaluating whether an outcomes-based payment arrangement is consistent with fair market value may evolve and adapt as the healthcare industry shifts to value-based care payment models and outcome-based payments. However, we believe that ensuring that the aggregate remuneration is consistent with fair market value helps ensure that monetary remuneration is paid for services that achieve legitimate outcome measures rather than referrals. And then they go on to explicitly say that they're not adopting any particular standard for how to do this fair market value assessment. So basically, I think it's a great question, and the takeaway is it might be hard. You might need to get creative, but you just need to find something that's supportable and probably work with your evaluator consultant friends to figure out what would be supportable.
Thanks, Adam. Hey, Rachel, we've got a couple of questions that relate back to our conversation relating to the value-based exceptions and safe harbor. One of them asks a good take a step back question, which is, in your view, what are the benefits of using a value-based exception or safe harbor as opposed to the existing exceptions, personal services arrangements, indirect comp, fair market value, et cetera? Let me start and then see if you have a similar view to me. At least with regard to START, the rule has always been that the exceptions are there, and you can try to meet one, but if you failed for one reason or another, you can always rely on another. Well, that's true so long as you can get your deal within the four corners of one of those new exceptions. This new category of exceptions and to a lesser extent the safe harbors do provide more flexibility than the historic exceptions that we've all grown to love. Not the least of which is avoiding a fair market value limitation on some of the risk-based, value-based exceptions. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing because then you can overpay someone, because there's lots of other reasons why you shouldn't do that. But it does allow for less worry about the footfalls or traps for the unwary that someone might come along later on and second guess whether you met fair market value, you met one of those other writing requirements or those formalities. At least that was my reaction to that question, Rachel. Did you want to respond to that too?
Absolutely. And I, couldn't agree with you more. The one thing that I would say is kind of what I said in response to the last question, which is there are some devils in the details with respect to formulating these arrangements. And so it's not something you can easily avail yourself of if you fail to satisfy another arrangement or another exception or safe harbor unless you intended to. So I would keep that in mind. But I'd also point out, with respect to Stark, only the middle risk and no risk requires set in advance. The full risk does not. And only the no risk requires commercial reasonableness. So, and as you said, there's no fair market value requirements. With respect to the federal anti-kickback statute safe harbors, they do have a value or volume requirement. But, the commercial reasonableness, less so, at least as to the full risk, something that we didn't get to, or that I don't think I pointed out earlier, it's interesting with the commercial reasonableness, and this may be a reason not to utilize some of the safe harbors for VBE, is that not only does the specific arrangement that you're looking at need to be commercially reasonable, so the specific compensation arrangement under the anti-kickback safe harbors for VBE, but also all of the arrangements within the VBE must be commercially reasonable. So that's something else to keep in mind as kind of a little potential footfall with respect to VBE.
I just wanted to add, it of course, it depends on what it is that you're trying to do. So for example, there are things that you can do with value-based enterprises that you might not be able to do with other exceptions, like, provide patient education or provide remuneration in the form of, video or print materials to benefit patients of a medical practice, or, providing data analytics services or something like that. So, ultimately it depends on what it is that you're trying to do. You obviously want to hit as many of the exceptions as you can to be safe, but I would consider that as well.
Rachel, while we're talking about the VBE exceptions, we got a question that I was thinking about as well, relating to what does it mean to be a full risk arrangement? Well, at the same time that CMS said, well, you can't have carve-outs for high-cost devices or transplants or things like that and still be full risk, they also came along and said that risk corridors or other risk mitigation strategies to cap risks or by stop loss protection to prevent against catastrophic losses aren't protected. And so the question, Rachel, is how broad do risk corridors have to be to still meet the full risk exception? And I'm not sure that CMS has provided that level of guidance in the preamble. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in terms of the parties that need to make up a VBE in order for there to be full risk, I think we have to go back to what full risk means under both definitions and to get our answer, which is only that the actual VBE itself take on full risk. It's not that all of the parties are taking on full risk. And, to your point, Larry, the question of whether they specified, they very much, particularly with respect to CMS, did not specify that, you need to have this party and this, you need to have a pharmacy and you need to have a hospital and an ASC and a skilled nursing facility. They were not so prescriptive. However, as I think Adam alluded to, and we only touched on briefly, under the safe harbors, they actually have excluded for at least the two risk categories, kind of who can be a part of those. So for instance, a compounding pharmacy can't be a part of those arrangements and be protected. And so, except for limited circumstances, DMEs cannot. And so it's very limited application. And so they have not made any efforts to say that this is what a VBE needs to look like. They're instead, staying very non-specific. I'll also point out with respect to Stark that, again, remind yourself that Stark is only implicated, as you started off with, Larry, by referrals between a physician and a DHS entity. And so, if it's not a physician and DHS entity, you don't need an exception to begin with.
Rachel, while I have got you on camera, and we're still talking about the value-based programs, one of our really detailed questions here is, does the gain or risk sharing as part of a CMS value-based program, such as direct contracting, qualify under the anti-kickback statute outcomes-based payment safe harbor? Is there anything that the value-based entity needs to do to memorialize it other than having an agreement with the provider aligned directly with the value-based compensation methodology? Long-winded, but I know you've had a chance to look at that question in advance so that I don't look quite as mean as it sounds.
Yeah, so, and also I think it'd be helpful if Adam wanted to respond on the outcome-based payment piece of that. But one of the things that I continue to find kind of interesting and that escapes me a bit, not directly answering the question, is that we don't yet know exactly what the waivers will be for direct contracting. And certainly when I was reviewing the final rules, I had direct contracting in mind. With respect to, could this be protective of any of those arrangements? I believe that it very much will be able to be protective and provides kind of the types of things that are going to be needed as we see these direct contracting entities, the DCEs, trying to create these provider networks. So I do think that this is going to be a good mechanism. I'm hopeful that there'll be additional waivers like we saw with MSSP2. And with respect to the specificity in the agreement, it really depends on the type of value-based purpose. It depends on the level of risk that's being engaged. And depending on all of those things will dictate, number one, what's in your governing documents, and number two, what needs to be in a writing between the parties. I'll point out even for CMS where I said, for the most part, there's really no signed writings required, that under kind of the mid-tier risk as well as the no risk, that you do have to have a contemporaneous writing meeting the set and advance requirement regarding how the compensation is going to be calculated for the participants. So again, this is going to be very much driven by the level of risk and the type of value-based purpose and enterprise. I'll also point out we didn't get time to talk too much about it. It's in the slides, and I'm sure you'll read it in the rules also. With the no risk categories, there are specific requirements, particularly on the OIG side, that you have to actually have these like measurable goals that are objective. For CMS, it's more optional, and it requires, if you're going to do it, it needs to be evidence-based. So these are all things that need to be documented in a writing. So as I've said, the devil will be in the details with these and availing yourselves of these exceptions and safe harbors.
Adam, did you want to add to that?
I think one thing I'd just like to add when you're thinking about cross-referencing some of the like VBE exceptions or safe harbors and the AKS outcomes-based payment, I just want to make the point that there are some places where they're not really comparable. The AKS outcomes-based payment safe harbor has a lot of those requirements that have traditionally been in safe harbors, but may not be in some of the other exceptions like fair market value and commercially reasonable and not volume or value based. So it's not to say that you can't, mix and match these things in certain circumstances to give yourself protection, but I just think you just need to be cautious about how you do it.
That makes sense, Adam. While I have you, one of the other questions we were asked relates back to the $500 limitation on incentives to patients. No cash or cash equivalent, but groceries seem to be okay. And the question asks, can we give a gift card for a grocery store delivery service or Amazon Prime membership? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the OIG over the years has had a lot of guidance on exactly this question about, what becomes cash equivalent. And so a gift card for groceries, particularly probably not in the same way that a transportation voucher, for like a cab is probably not, or an Uber is probably not a cash equivalent. But once you start getting to beyond that, a gift card to Amazon or an Amazon Prime membership, I think that's another story that can be used for such a diverse array of goods and services that it becomes a cash equivalent. So it's a little bit of an individualized determination. But it's true that sometimes these things that are basically vouchers for a specific item or service can qualify as not being cash equivalent.
Thank you. One of the questions we got related to the warranty changes, allowing for bundled items and services warranties. And a very good question is, could the warranty cover privacy breaches for devices capturing PHI? And, my answer to that is, a carefully drafted warranty that is associated with the remedy associated with an item can also include remedies for services, but it could not just be services only. I'd also want to remind people that both statutory exceptions and regulatory safe harbors under the anti-kickback statute are not mandatory, and that there are plenty of technology contracts with indemnification provisions and breach provisions, which are perfectly valid and industry standard to help protect an organization that hires a firm to assist with PHI, which then go awry. But I think the answer to your question, by the way, is yes. Any other questions that are trickling along here that folks would like to respond to? We've got only a couple of minutes left. I want to make sure that we get to the top of the line here. I'm flipping through to see which ones we didn't answer during the program. Oh, one question, Rachel, and that you and I should probably talk about is, and I tried to address it a little bit while we were going, is reacting to what is a value-based enterprise. And I brought this up as a question percolated along on our list, that these regulations aren't creating as much of a formalism around the value-based enterprise as in many other organizations that are out there, such as the ACO. And indeed, when you read the preamble, the CMS is particularly looking at, virtually any entity or even a group of entities could be a value-based enterprise. Do you have any additional blocks you'd like to share, Rachel, on that?
Absolutely, and I do think it'd be helpful. I mean, I don't want to just kind of read, but I will, because I think it is helpful for everyone to see this in context, although you'll see that a lot of what we've talked about kind of will come together to define it, which is a value-based enterprise means 2 or more VBE participants, and that's really all it requires. It can be loosely affiliated, no entity is required, that collaborate to achieve at least one value-based purpose, so you don't need to have more than one is sufficient, each of which is a party to a value-based arrangement with a value-based enterprise. And they have an accountable body or person responsible for the financial operational oversight of the value-based enterprise. So this is kind of that governing body and the governing document that I was talking about. And then finally, that they have a governing document that describes the value-based enterprise and how the VBE participants intend to achieve their value-based purposes. And so that's really what the magic is a group of people coming together. There needs to be kind of similar to an ACO, some sort of governing body, although in the commentary in the final rule, they talk about that it's really sufficient to use the CFO of a hospital, or, there's nothing specific. It doesn't need to be a separate governing board from the entity that might be leading the VBE. And there needs to be these governing documents. Another thing, that we didn't touch on that is, I think, important is that in the no risk categories, both for CMS and OIG, there are these kind of interesting, like the governing body has to do this review and assessment of kind of whether they're meeting their value-based purposes. And to the extent, and they have to do it at least once annually, and for arrangements that are less than a year, they must do it at least once during the arrangement. And if they find during that assessment that the value-based purposes are not being met, then there are these very specific requirements that in order to keep yourself available to the safe harbor, you either have to terminate the arrangement within 60 or 90 days or reform it such that the purpose is being achieved, and then you must reevaluate. So again, these, as you said at the very beginning, Larry, are some of the most dense regulations that we've seen in quite a while. And so there's a lot to read and see there, although they do kind of create some flexibility.
And I think Rachel is getting the last word as we run to the end of our time together. I want to thank everybody who was signing in today. I apologize for those of you who couldn't get to your answers. We'll follow up with you. We will also send you the slides. Maggie, did you have any final comments on the CLE code stuff? I guess if they email you at what email address should they send it to?
They should send any CLE questions or concerns to M. Weschler, that's WESCHLER @Foley.com. And we will take note of your name and make sure that you get credit where credit is due.
Thank you. And thank you all for your time with us today. Don, do you have any parting words?
No, not for me, but I really appreciate everybody tuning in, and we all hope that it was some value too.
Thank you all, and have a good afternoon.